Namaste and welcome to Chitti Media. I'm joined by Cleo Paskal today for a conversation. She is a non-resident scholar fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a senior fellow at the Usinus Foundation, fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a collaborator at the Network for Strategic Analysis, and she's also on the advisory board, international advisory board rather, for the Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific and Global Counterterrorism Council. She specializes in strategic issues in the Indo-Pacific. Cleo, thank you so much for joining me. Namaste and how are you?
Namaste. It's a great pleasure. I've enjoyed watching your channel and have learned quite a lot from the incredible people you have on. So it's a privilege and a pleasure to be with you.
It's a privilege and a pleasure to have you here on the show. Let me begin by asking you about what's going on in your home country, Canada, because that is something that's taken all of us by surprise. Because just a few months ago, when we had the farmers' protest in India, which also had several elements which we won't get into, the Canadian government, especially Prime Minister Trudeau, stood up for the rights of Indian farmers, and he said that Canada, as a democracy, will protect and stand up for democratic rights of the underprivileged across the world. And right now, you see an emergency being declared. What has gone wrong?
Right. So this is quite something for me because, as you know, I look a lot at undemocratic countries like China, for example, and so I deal with people who are being persecuted by their own systems. But Chinese in Canada, for example, who have to exhibit a lot of bravery to talk about what's going on in China, and suddenly I kind of found myself in a very minor way starting to worry about whether I should self-censor about what I had to say about my own country, because the methods being used by the government were in some ways reminiscent of the sort of methods that were used in other countries, like, for example, China, where you don't really know where the line is, and if you cross the line, the repercussions can be quite severe. So, for example, in one case that was brought up by one member of parliament, one of their constituents sent $50 to support the trucker convoy at a time when it was legal and found her bank accounts frozen. Now, she didn't have the information to know when she made that $50 donation that that was something that would be risky. That gray zone area what took everybody by surprise. And so that makes you want to just shut down and not say anything. And it's that kind of internal self-censorship that becomes very, very dangerous in a democracy. It's whether you agree with the policies or not, whether you agree with the protests or not, the idea of putting in these policies that have no clear boundaries, that haven't really been properly discussed. Nobody knew what the Emergency Act was when it was put in place, creates a climate of fear and division that was extraordinary, happened very, very quickly. So the Emergency Act has been kind of taken away, but the reports are still that people who had their bank accounts frozen, there was testimony recently, that will be on their record for their whole lives. Okay? So it creates a situation where unless there is a change in government policy, they've injected that fear of protest into the system that wasn't there before. It changes the dynamic of the relationship between the citizen and the state. And for some, it ruptures the social contract. So it was a cataclysmic event, I'd say, for Canadian polity. And the repercussions are going to be quite long-standing.
Indeed, and I believe that the Western media is also being criticized, especially in India, as far as the farmers' protest is concerned, because they seem to show some sort of a double standard. Especially if we were to analyze, and comparatively study the reportage of how, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times covered the farmers' protest in India and how they're criticizing the truckers in Canada. So, do you think that there is some sort of a dichotomy in the way in which they approach these things?
So it's a good question, and it's a fundamental question, and it has sort of different components to it. So the first component I'd say is, has Western media been fair to India? And that's obviously not, and that's been going on for decades. So that's kind of not to be debated, and you can extend that. I mean, we know the issues with The Economist and with all of the other. I mean, that's very clear. The question is external media. What's interesting actually is both the New York Times, I think, and the Post came out with editorials against the Trudeau policies on the emergency, and that actually may have been a factor, one of many, for revoking it. However, within Canada, the mainstream media was pretty consistently following the government line to describe the protests, and it could be that they truly believed it, but another factor is also that there's a lot of government money that goes into the media. So the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is, of course, federally funded. And the opposition Conservatives have said that one of their platforms may be to defund the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So if you're in the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, you sort of have a vested interest in presenting things in a certain way. Also, throughout the pandemic, there were quite large transfers of money from the federal government to support a whole range of industries to get through the pandemic. And one of them was the media, the kind of mainstream large media companies. So that may or may not also have been a factor. But the fact that we're even questioning it, the fact that, some people are saying, well, it's because they got, government money and money from the Liberals that they're reporting this way, shows that there has been a fundamental breakdown in trust. And it's that breakdown in trust that that compounds with the breakdown in the trust with governance as a whole, which is what these protests were about. These protests were about government mandates that the protesters thought made no holistic health sense, and they weren't anti-vaccine. Many of the people involved were vaccinated. They were anti-government mandates, and it's worth explaining that Canada has some of the most severe mandates of anywhere in the Western world, in fact, anywhere. So in order to get on a plane or a train or a boat, like a ferry that's federally regulated, you need to be fully vaccinated if you're 12 years or over. There were situations, one which was described by a Liberal MP who explained why he was against his own government's policies on it, was if you were a child and you tested negative in Quebec, but you were near somebody who had been diagnosed positive, you had to quarantine for an extended period of time on your own in a windowless room in some cases. And so what it was creating was a massive mental health crisis across Canada, where our suicide rates have gone up, our depression rates have gone up, in categories of the population that were very low risk of the disease, especially the young. So the youth, the sort of 16 to 30, who are very low risk if you don't have comorbidities of dying of COVID, were seeing their lives affected in such a way that it was extremely heartbreaking. And so people were demonstrating very much on behalf of their children and what it was doing to the people who they loved and who they saw around them. So you already had that breakdown in trust in the medical establishment, and then that was compounded by this breakdown in trust in the media And then you added this third element, which is a breakdown in trust in the financial systems, because suddenly they could seize your money or freeze your assets or shut down your business if you did something that was considered politically unacceptable. So and that I think is also going to have very long-term economic impacts for Canada. We know that there are many people, many Americans who are now rethinking investments in Canada because our Attorney General specifically said, if you are a Trump supporter who supported these people to a certain degree, you should be worried. Well, there are like 75 million Trump supporters in the US. Right? They're close to half of the voting population at the last election. So does that mean that none of them should invest in Canada because at some point that they're voting for a legitimate candidate in a presidential election or donating to a political party puts them at risk of losing their investment? So the reaction to the convoy, to the truckers' convoy, has created this rolling fracturing of trust within Canada and of outside countries and people looking at Canada, including India. I mean, India, you don't, whenever Canada tries to say anything to India anymore, how seriously is it going to be taken? I mean, it shouldn't have been taken seriously in the first place, but now there's absolutely no legitimacy. So, Trudeau was just in London and there were protesters on the street in London protesting him. So the hope is, as a Canadian, the hope is this is a contained situation to a specific, leader and not the nation as a whole, but who knows? This was not expected, and we don't know what the long-term implications are for Canada and the world.
Indeed, if we were to observe the media and how it's behaving of late, especially because the world has had such crises, the COVID-19 pandemic and now the truckers' protest and the Ukraine crisis is going on, you see that a new propaganda machinery is being sprouted all across the world because information war has become very critical to winning the perception battle as well. And China is already working very hard at it. I don't know to what degree they're successful, but they do have a very robust propaganda machinery. So right now the talk is also about Putin's aggression in Ukraine emboldening China to invade Taiwan. And already China is working on a media warfare strategy, and you've written about this. So could you summarize this to our viewers who may not have read your article?
Thank you, sure. So the question is, it's worth going back to the basic. What does China want? And when I say China, what do I mean by China? So basically, I mean the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So what does the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party want? First of all, they want the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to stay intact. So that's, kind of self-preservation, obviously. But then second to that is they want China to be number one in the world in terms of what's called comprehensive national power. That's a term that is in the Chinese think tanks. It's an overt metric by which they rank countries. So there's a whole range of factors that go in. Chinese strategist will calculate a country's comprehensive national power. So it's all the things that you'd usually expect, like military power, economic power, that sort of thing. But it'll also include access to natural resources, whether it's in your country or in another country, but you have control over it. It'll be communications technology, intellectual property, whether it's your own or whether you've managed to steal it. So there are all these multiple factors that go into creating this empirical analysis of comprehensive national power. In order to achieve comprehensive national power, China has a doctrine that was kind of very explicitly put forward in a book in the late 90s by two PLA Air Force colonels called Unrestricted Warfare. And the basic premise of unrestricted warfare is China can do whatever it wants. Anything that works is legitimate. And an aspect of that unrestricted warfare is what they also call the three warfares. And this is all over the Chinese strategic literature. The three warfares are psychological warfare. So that would be like continuously flying the air sorties over Taiwan to wear them down, to make them feel like defeat is inevitable. The second is lawfare. So they use countries' own court systems to try to tie up the competition. So India, for example, managed to ban WeChat. When the US tried to ban WeChat, this grassroots organization of WeChat users sprang up to say that this was a restriction of their First Amendment rights, and they used the courts to tie up that banning, and WeChat is still available in the US. The third is media warfare or propaganda, whatever, that medium or communications. Sorry, that sound is my puppy dog digging into the carpet for the night. So
I hope we get to see him or her.
I can show you after he's settled. Otherwise, otherwise you'll mostly get to see him going. So
we're discussing Chinese propaganda.
Yeah. So the media warfare is a very large focus, and it's not just traditional media, but it's also social media. So the PLA has several 100,000 people dedicated to manipulating and shaping the social media environment. And they're also very good at using AI for what's called mass customized manipulation. So they will get all of your metadata, especially if you have TikTok and WeChat and all that sort of stuff that India has very cleverly banned. And it will do a profile of you, and then it will start to do whatever it's intended to do. And in many cases, what it's intended to do largely is to create social division. So it actually doesn't care whether you're pro-vax or anti-vax, for example, in the US. It just wants to drive you further apart and harden your position so that you fight each other. Right? So this Chinese media warfare, which includes social media, is very highly resourced. One of the best experts on this is Professor Carrie Gershanik, who's written a very good book called Political Warfare, who estimates that there are billions that are spent on this per year, and it's incredibly effective. So in the case of something like India, for example, when there was that attack on the iPhone parts manufacturing plant in Bengaluru, India is an existential threat to China for many reasons, but one of them is because it has the capacity to take a lot of the supply chain away from China, because India is a young, well-educated, largely English-speaking population that integrates well into the larger economy, into the global economy. And it has a better and more transparent rule of law than China. So China has to feed the impression that India is not a good place for investment. So in the case of the iPhone parts manufacturing plant attack, what you saw was images of the destruction in the factory were distributed online extremely quickly and very widely. Similarly with the farmers' protests, whatever the issues involved with the farmers' protests, the amplification of this being a node of instability would have been facilitated through Chinese propaganda networks in order to make India look like an unstable location, especially because of supply chain relocation. So the effects on the West are very socially destructive, but the effects in India are very socially destructive and economically destructive as well. And it's being used to target Taiwan in a everywhere that's a threat to China is being targeted by this sort of thing.
So extremely interesting. Thank you for these very interesting insights. And before we delve further into the other topics, I want to redirect your attention to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and Russia. So, what do you think this conflict will have in terms of its effects on, affairs in the Indo-Pacific?
So this is a very dynamic situation, and these are early days. So everything I say could already be wrong, just because I might be wrong, but they could be even more wrong in a day or two, or 3 or a month or whatever. But what assuming what's going on in Ukraine continues, the effects are going to be catastrophic for individual nations for sure, because it's going to push up food and energy costs. And we already have economies that are on edge because of the COVID-related restrictions. And then suddenly the energy costs triple and food supply, because, so we've seen the food, just the kind of food angle before. We've seen it trigger or be part of things like what happened in Egypt around the 2008 food price spike. So countries that are not food or energy self-sufficient are at huge risk of social instability, because they're already on edge for a lot of the reasons that I described in Canada around what happened during COVID. A lot of mental health issues and family stresses and job losses. And then you put this on top of that. So domestically, there are those issues. Geopolitically, I think that there's probably a faction, at least within China, that is saying, if we go fast and hard into Taiwan, the West isn't going to do anything. What's happened with Ukraine is it's taken long enough for the West to kind of start to work together a little bit on it. But at the beginning, it was kind of a shocked response. And I think the message from that for Beijing is, if you're going to go into Taiwan, you cut off the power, you cut off the cyber, you bomb it into submission, you go in as fast as you possibly can. And it's interesting that when former Secretary of State Pompeo was in Taiwan just recently, meeting President Tsai, there was a power outage. And it would be hard not to think that that was deliberate, right? Especially given the way it was subsequently portrayed in Chinese media. So it's also an indication that, China probably can cut off the power to Taiwan pretty effectively, which Russia didn't do to Ukraine, at least not yet. Yes. So if that happens, if China decides to go into Taiwan and goes into Taiwan hard, and there's no effective Western response, then many of the countries down the coast of China, so Philippines, Malaysia, and then the ones on the coast, like Korea. Korea's a bit, we don't know what's going to happen. In fact, there's about to be an election. Cambodia, they may all say, U.S. isn't going to protect us either. We need to cut a deal with China. Japan will probably at least try to defend itself. Australia, it depends probably on who's in power, but that scenario is pretty well known, that you can lose what's called that first island chain and further down to Chinese sphere of influence very quickly. I would argue that it's also possible, because of certain issues around the US engagement in the Pacific Islands, which we can talk about if you want, that many of the countries across the Pacific, Palau, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, all the way through to Hawaii, could also fall into the Chinese sphere of influence extremely quickly. So you could have sort of a north-south thing and a west to east band where China could start to deploy from in very short order. So part of my job is to think of worst case scenarios, and frankly, I've been underestimating how bad it can get, and I hope that in this case I'm overestimating how bad it can get. But all of the pieces are in place for both of those things to happen, for that to be lost and this to be lost if the Taiwan piece gets taken out by Beijing.
Indeed, even in India, we need to be given reminders once in a while when the Chinese, make some incursions into the Indian territory. That's when we wake up to the reality and smell the coffee and realize the aggression that the CCP tries to portray against, the rest of the world. And this is a very scary scenario. But in terms of you've also written about the media strategy and the warfare, the tactics that China used to cover up, or rather divert the world's attention during the COVID-19 crisis. So, if you were to summarize China's media strategy during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially because they were receiving a lot of flack for what was happening around the world, how would you summarize?
It's a good question. There was, well, first of all, there was an attempt to create confusion about the origin of what it was, and also what the disease was itself. And it's worth being very clear that whether it came from a lab, whether it was deliberately released or not, one thing that we do know is that they knew they had an outbreak, and China blocked internal flights from Wuhan and allowed international flights from Wuhan. So they knew that they had something that they didn't want to have spread within China, but it was perfectly fine for them to spread to the rest of the world. And that is consistent with the comprehensive national power approach to looking at international relations, because you can improve your country's comprehensive national power relative to others in two ways. One is you get better, and that's what most countries try to do, is they try to improve themselves. The other is you can knock everybody else down, and then comparatively, you've done better. So if you have a pandemic, if you're China and you have a pandemic, and you just can try to contain it, that's going to knock you down. But if you spread it, and at the same time, as they seem to have been doing, you're buying up PPE, and you're not saying that there's human-to-human transmission, all that sort of stuff, you're knocking everybody else down. And one of the few global economies to grow during the past 2 years was the Chinese economy. And I think that they overestimated how much they would benefit from it, because immediately after, within the sort of few months after that, that was when you saw them pushing into Galwan, for example, and making some incursions in the South China Sea. And then they tried to, when Australia quite courageously said that they wanted to do an investigation into the origins of COVID, they put in place a whole bunch of economic sanctions against Australia to try to knock it down. So there was an attempt to mute information about the nature of COVID, partially, I suspect, because they wanted to create confusion in the response. Second, they wanted to create confusion about the origin of it. And there was, as we now know, there seemed to have been, elements within other countries that were fine to facilitate those two elements of the narrative for their own reasons. I would just say that I think that one thing that has come out of this is that there has been much more appreciation for Indian media, which has been trying to cover this as transparently as possible from very early on. So I think, and many people were in the West were stuck inside and only had access to, to the internet, and were introduced to Indian media over the past 2 years, including through coverage on some of these issues and on alternative responses to dealing with COVID, as we saw, for example, with what happened with UP and some of the sort of treatment kits and things like that. So at the same time that some of this social contract stress or fracturing was happening in the West, there was also an increased awareness of what was going on in India by a lot of people who may not have had the time or the awareness to start to follow the Indian media. And we're seeing that now also with the Ukraine crisis. We're seeing a lot more people getting their news out of the Indian media. And I mean, I can tell you on the trucker stuff, I was getting a lot of clips sent to me by Americans of Indians who are covering the trucker the convoy. So there is this sort of detrimental international media effect of the Chinese role in distorting some of this stuff. But I think that at the same time, there's also been a positive effect of more awareness of some of the Indian media coverage, which I don't think possibly would have happened otherwise.
I'm glad the world is taking attention to the other side of Indian media, which does not yell, which does not interrupt, and which does not shout on television. So I'm really glad, and I think we are also playing a small part in it. So we are quite humbled by your words.
Well, I think I'm grateful for, because the world is, there's been this artificial dichotomy created of there's the West and there's China, and there's nothing in between. There's nothing else. There's not, and you've got a country of like 1.4 billion people who are accessible to many in the West because you're kind enough to speak English some of the time, for some of the, I mean, I know that the language media is even better, but it has been accessible. So I think it's been many are setting a bar that is very helpful, so you don't get caught in this, it's only this way or it's only that way. And there are other ways as well. And I think a lot of the rest of the world, I have a lot of friends in the Pacific Islands, are appreciative of having another option or a complementary option that might reflect some of what they're experiencing a little bit more accurately.
Indeed, I had a very poor joke coming up. In fact, one of the if you were to term Chinese media strategy for creating a confusion on the origins of the pandemic, perhaps it would be called Confucianism. I don't know if you got that. But speaking about China, it's not just countries like the United States or its allies or its partners that are inconvenienced and worried by the growing aggression and its salami slicing tactics, but because of its economic prowess as well, the kind of damage that it's doing in Maldives, for that matter, is extremely worrying to realize how dangerous of a precedent the Chinese are setting. So could you give us an overview as to the kind of an influence that China has over other countries, and even Chinese diaspora, for that matter, because in the United States, this is an issue that's being discussed of late, especially with the activities going on in college campuses where there are a lot of spying activities being unearthed by the police authorities, if I'm not mistaken. So would you say that this is a form of modern colonization that the Chinese are doing?
Those are good and complicated questions. So I'll take them separately. First, the economics, and then the population. So in many of the countries that China goes into, and I'll use the Solomon Islands as an example, because it until 2019, the Solomon Islands recognized Taiwan, and it switched to China in 2019. And we've seen so it's a very short time, but we've seen a very substantial shift in the domestic reality of the people of the Solomon Islands as a result of that shift. So money went through the prime minister to specific members of parliament who supported his policies and supported the relationship with the CCP. At the same time, in one particular province, Malaita province, which did not want to switch to the CCP, wanted to stay with Taiwan, and a big reason for that is very important, which is that, and we know this because they put out a statement in 2019 saying they did not want CCP companies operating in their province. And it had to do with them being people of faith. They're devout Christian, and they didn't want to deal with a country where they actively persecute people of faith. And so, which is very important. Because in the Western discussion about China, this issue of faith is not brought up very much. But in a lot of the rest of the world, people's identity, personal, individual identity is often defined by their faith and their family, right? And then ideally, they want to live in an environment of freedom where they can practice their faith and live with their family in freedom. So, and in China, of course, China actively persecutes faith domestically. Obviously the Uyghurs, but definitely the Tibetans and the Christians, and and the Falun Gong, who are, and they're used for body parts, for transplants, for pay. I mean, it's horrific, because you have to have sole reliance on the Chinese Communist Party. That's the model. So they don't want you to have an extended family system, which is one of the, they got the one-child policy destroyed the family. And they don't want you to be a person of faith, because that also gives you a sense of self or identity or security that is not dependent on the state. So the people of Malaita province, the Solomon Islands, recognize that. People of faith can recognize when a system is coming in that is antithetical to them being allowed to express their devotion in whatever way it is. And the leader of that province, a man called Daniel Sudani, got sick, and he needed medical care outside of the country. And the prime minister, and later came out, the Chinese representatives, they didn't want to facilitate his medical treatment. It would be more convenient for them if he died, because he was taking this rather strong principled stand. And Australia, which is the neighbor and which is sort of the Western strategic representative, so to speak, it was in the region, didn't facilitate. They said, sure, you can come to Australia for medical treatment. It's going to cost you $100,000. He was an honest politician. He didn't have $100,000. So what happened was, somebody who you interviewed, in fact, Professor M.D. Nalapat, heard about the case and recognized, here's another, man who is a principled man who is fighting for democracy and for his people. And he got in touch with people he knew in Taiwan, in the president's office, and the president of Taiwan ensured that this man got treatment. So it was a network of people who are people of integrity and honesty, and who believe in democracy, and who sort of helped each other through that network. That's something that's very difficult for the Chinese to incorporate into their systems. because nobody made any money off of it. Nobody, it was just it's just good people doing things for good people. Okay, so you had this situation in the Solomons where there was this buildup of kind of CCP-linked corruption that was distorting the economy, that was using the social credit system to punish people like Daniel Soudani in his province who didn't buckle under, and it eventually blew up into a riot on the first day of the sitting of Parliament recently, a few months ago, and most of the commercial sector was burnt down, which happens to be mostly run by Chinese, recently arrived ethnic Chinese. The result was the Australians suddenly sent in police and military along with some other forces. So you had the situation where you had the Australians coming in to create a secure zone for a corrupt pro-PRC government. They soon realized that there was a problem with that, and then they started talking about maybe withdrawing, and then very soon after, the Chinese announced they would be sending police advisors and riot gear. So the situation that we have now is the police advisors have arrived in the Solomon Islands, and they are going to be working very closely with the Solomon Islands police and this corrupt pro-PRC prime minister in the Solomons. And this is an incredibly dangerous situation for people like Daniel Soudani, and those who don't want to buckle under CCP influence. This started in September 2019. It took less than 2.5 years to turn this country that had some problems for the Chinese to come in to create even bigger problems and suck in a Western power with a very short-sighted policy and create a situation where you have Chinese police advisors sitting in the heart of the decision-making processes in the country. And they're talking about doing things like delaying the election and trying to do all sorts of stuff like that. So it may look like economic engagement at the beginning, but it very quickly spirals into creating the goal is to create these vassal states that end up contributing to China's comprehensive national power across the region. Doesn't take long and it doesn't take much.
Right. And it's not just limited to that, because the Chinese.
Sorry, but I want to go back before we move on. I want to talk about this demographic issue.
Sure. I was about to ask you that. So, what kind of an influence does the Chinese CCP hold over the diaspora that's spread around the world, especially the United States? Okay,
so the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party are the Chinese people. But that's the Chinese Communist Party has killed more Chinese than anybody else. If you look at what Mao did with the Great Leap Forward, and if you look at the people of Xinjiang, the people of Tibet, it's debatable, but they're technically Chinese citizens, right? So you look at what happened with Hong Kong. If you want to understand how terrible this system is and how ruthless those leaders are, if you can find a Chinese person from Hong Kong or Tibet or Xinjiang or any of those other places who's willing to tell you, they can tell you more clearly than anybody else can. So just to be clear that there is a huge degree of fear built into the systems within China, and that fear can be exported along with the population. So if somebody comes to study, you're talking about the US, if you have business linkages or family linkages into China, they have leverage over you, right? Because there is no rule of law, it's ruled by law. The party will use the law, as we talked about with lawfare, in order to control behavior. So there's that aspect of it. But I also wouldn't underestimate, especially with the younger Chinese population, there is the ones who don't remember the Cultural Revolution and the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, there is a large degree of national pride. So in some cases on the university campuses, if you've grown up in the Chinese system, a certain proportion who come to study somewhere else will truly believe in what they were taught about the century of humiliation and Chinese national pride and the role of Chinese Communist Party in bringing the country out of poverty, all that stuff. And nobody, if you grow up with that, you don't want to hear your country criticized. So there's a degree of that. And then those who do want to discuss things that might be a surprise to them, like what happened in Tiananmen Square, or things like that, they will be concerned that they will be reported back on by the cadres that are linked to the party, and that could affect themselves and their family back in China. So they export that system where adherence to the party gives benefits, and criticizing the party is something to be scared of. That comes with those newly arrived Chinese, especially if they have family or business linkages back into China. But there are also very large ethnic Chinese populations that have been in the US for 150 years that are, which this doesn't apply to at all.
How sustainable is this over the long run? And I'm specifically pointing to the CCP media's outreach strategy and the kind of cover-up that they've done, since the last 2 years. Is this model sustainable, and how can the world actually counter the kind of propaganda that the Chinese are disseminating?
Well, that's your job. So it's not like India doesn't have enough things to do already, but keep reporting on it and doing the investigation, and I honestly do believe that I do believe in the power of the truth. There's this old St. Augustine saying, that the truth is like a lion. You don't have to protect it. If you let it free, it'll protect itself. So I think as sort of the more bits of the truth come out, as that pride of lions gets bigger, it's going to be harder and harder to ignore the roar. And people can feel it, that was sort of kind of what happened with, around a lot of these protests where, people were saying these mandates don't really make any scientific sense. You're telling me this didn't come from China, but where did it come from? Whatever, people start, if people have the time, and many people don't have the time because they're too busy trying to just survive and earn a living and get their kids through school and whatever, then consistent dissonance in information first is disorienting, and eventually it can be angering, which means you're a little bit scared of it. And then ideally you start to try to think it through or find other information sources. So that's why what you're finding is some of the most important media figures in the US now are, whether you like them or not, whether you agree or not, are people like Joe Rogan, who will just have, a 3 or 4 hour conversation with somebody, because they trust the listener to, figure it out for themselves if they get enough people with enough different opinions to think it through. So, we're a long way from resolving this problem that you're describing, but I have hope.
But yeah, because of the democratization of social media, I think people do come to their own judgments because the internet's full of information, and I think media literacy is improving around the world, and especially in India, we've had a few issues in the past, especially because there was a digital thrust that we did not see before, and suddenly everybody, a majority of the population has access to high-speed internet and smartphones, and right now everybody is getting educated on by themselves rather. So the day we get banned by in China, we will consider that as a badge of honor. So we look forward to that day. You also wrote a very interesting piece for the Sunday Guardian, and you presented a case study on how China buys foreign politicians. This seems to be extremely interesting. So please do tell us more about this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, the case study I used was the Solomon Islands, in fact, and it's each country is a little bit different because each country has its own divisions and its own mechanisms. But one thing that China is very good is at identifying fault lines within a society, and then co-opting subnational groupings and giving them more money and prestige and media play, and building them up so that they can ride along with them. And this isn't exactly kind of what we're talking about, but what it does often is it finds legitimate concerns, groups that have been disenfranchised or discriminated against, and then builds them up and rides them into a crisis situation. So the complaints can be legitimate, but the solutions that are being proposed are often very socially destructive. So when the grievances come forward, it's very important to think about, first of all, is this a legitimate grievance? And in many cases it might be. But is the solution that's being proposed actually going to solve that grievance, or is that highly socially detrimental to the larger polity? So I'm sure you can think of some examples on your own, but that's one of the things that it does, in the process of trying to create chaos in a society. And one of the goals of creating this chaos, as we saw in the Solomon Islands, is if you can create enough chaos, you can justify authoritarianism. And if you're an authoritarian country, you may get, the chances of you being isolated from the West are higher, which means that your options, geopolitical options, are more limited. And so you end up closer to China. So it benefits China to take a democracy, to find grievances within that society, to create divisions, to push people into a corner so that they react more violently, so that the controlling group becomes more authoritarian and gets alienated from the West and falls into China's camp. So you can see that in places like Myanmar, for example. But you also saw it in the Solomon Islands. So, an ideal country for China is an authoritarian, repressive country that's reliant on China for police trainers and riot gear and international representation and that sort of thing. So, basically to create little mini Chinas that are dependent on the mother China to keep it going.
Right.
And they do that initially. I mean, you're talking about buying up politicians. It's pretty easy to buy up politicians, but you can do it through bringing them on trips to China where they miraculously win at the casino, or funding campaigns, or making sure that their brother or son is making a lot of money in some business somewhere. It's
Right.
not hard.
It's right out of a movie. Well, it's extremely interesting. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you, since you also observe the Indian affairs to a certain degree, what do you think are the hits and misses of this particular government led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, especially since it seems to have towed a different approach from the previous one? And because we've had Chinese aggression at our borders, there has been some, give and take at the borders. So, what do you think, needs tweaking in our Chinese in our China policy for that matter?
Well, I don't know what needs tweaking. I mean, I learn from Indian strategists kind of almost daily about innovative ways of dealing with geopolitical threats. And I'll talk about China, but first I'd like to just mention my respect for what India's done in Ukraine about getting students out. Now, India is the only country I've heard talk about its nationals, its people in Ukraine, and making that a priority for their policy regarding the situation. Now, I don't know how many Canadians are in Ukraine, and I don't know whether an effort has been made to get them out. But I know that India cared about its people and its children in many cases, and made it a priority to get them out, to the point where other countries are putting the Indian flag, on their belongings because they wish they were Indian, because they know that the Indian government would try to get them out. I mean, I remember a time when Canadians would put flags on their backpacks so that they wouldn't be considered American, or whatever. But this is a whole different thing. So I think that is a testament to an India that we may not have seen to this degree previously. I know there are cases in Kuwait. There are other cases as well, but this one is really noticeable, especially in comparison to how all the other countries have dealt with this particular situation. And the government deserves a lot of credit for that. As regards China, so we talked about China's comprehensive national power and how it attempts to infiltrate a country in multiple ways. And the Indian strategic community has been at the forefront of understanding that and putting together what could be called a comprehensive national defense, where it has defended itself in multiple sectors. So, within a couple of weeks of Galwan, India was banning the Chinese apps. Right, that I think surprised a lot of us who aren't as sophisticated, don't come from the land of the Arthashastra, where you've had this kind of 2,000 years of strategic culture, and we're wondering why ban the apps. And then once that was explained, that first of all, it's spyware, it's sucking up the metadata, it's helping the Chinese develop their AI systems, it's a very good espionage technique for getting leverage on Indians. It gives advantages in commercial transactions because you can find out what the Indians are bidding when they're competing against Chinese companies in Africa, for example, if you can have access to the phones and the communication system. There are a whole range of malign activity that was being accomplished by getting those Chinese apps on the Indian phones. And the Indian strategic community realized it and banned them. No other country has managed to do that yet. Then within a very short period of time after that, there was a reassessment of Chinese investment in foreign direct investment. When the Mumbai electrical grid was hit, because remember, China kept hitting India. They didn't do it kinetically like in Galwan, but they went after the iPhone parts manufacturing plant. They hit the Mumbai electrical grid. The Maoists killed about 20 people. There was a whole range of threats to India. India hit back in a range of ways. It talked about what happened with the Mumbai electrical grid. It talked about what happened with the iPhone parts manufacturing plant. when there were odd people who were, the backing parts of the protests, farmers' protests, there was discussions about where was that money coming from, where was the backing coming from. So this comprehensive defense that was put in place by India to deal with the Chinese comprehensive national power push against India was something that I've personally learned a lot from. So I would definitely not have the hubris to say where the misses were in India. I really don't. India, the Indian strategists have to deal with a strategic environment that's much more complex than I could possibly imagine, with the countries on its border, and I've been very privileged to be able to learn from it along the way.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Cleo ji. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I do miss your lectures at the Manipal College, where I was a student of geopolitics, and this felt like I was revisiting a lot of the things that we used to discuss back in college. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
It's a pleasure, and I look forward to getting back to Tiger Circle and getting a good cup of tea and a good argument from those Manipal students. They always make me work to defend my positions, which is exactly what needs to happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.